Racist cop hits black man, then discovers he's her boss. Part 1. The incident officer, Rebecca Thornton, had always prided herself on being tough, relentless, and unyielding in her duty. She viewed herself as a soldier on the front lines, keeping order in a world she saw as chaotic. But her definition of order often meant profiling individuals based on her biases rather than actual threats. And tonight, her prejudices would lead to a mistake that would change her life forever. It was a slow Tuesday night when she spotted a black man in an expensive suit standing next to a sleek black BMW parked outside a high-end restaurant. Instinctively, suspicion flared in her mind. To her, a black man in that setting meant either a drug dealer, a scam artist, or a thief about to make a getaway. The thought of a successful businessman never crossed her mind. Flipping on her siren, she pulled up and stepped out of her cruiser. "Sir, hands where I can see them," she ordered, her hand resting on her holstered gun. The man turned, his expression a mixture of confusion and irritation. "Is there a problem, officer?" "I need to see some ID," she snapped. He raised an eyebrow, but reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, handing it over without resistance. She glanced at the name. Jonathan King. She had no idea who he was. That would soon change. But in that moment, her prejudices dictated her actions. "What are you doing in this area?" she demanded. Jonathan exhaled, trying to remain calm. "I just had dinner. I was about to leave." Rebecca wasn't convinced. "I need to check if this car is yours." Jonathan frowned. "It is. You can run the plates." She didn't bother. Instead, she took a step closer, invading his space. "Step away from the vehicle," she ordered. Jonathan hesitated, his patience running thin. "Officer, this is unnecessary." Rebecca saw his refusal to immediately comply as defiance. "Are you resisting?" she asked, her tone sharp. Jonathan sighed and took a step back. "I'm not resisting, but I do think this is harassment." Her temper flared. Without thinking, she shoved him. Hard. Jonathan stumbled, but caught himself, looking at her in pure disbelief. And then the situation escalated beyond her control. Part 2. The truth is revealed. A nearby restaurant patron had recorded everything. A bystander, clearly outraged, stepped forward. "You just assaulted that man for no reason." Rebecca ignored them, pulling out her radio. "I need backup at my location." Jonathan shook his head. "You really don't want to do this," Rebecca sneered. "Oh, I think I do." Just then, another police cruiser arrived. Out stepped Sergeant Davis, Rebecca's superior. He took one look at the situation, then at Jonathan. His face went pale. "Officer Thornton, step away from him." "Now." Rebecca frowned. "Sergeant, I have the situation under control." Sergeant Davis's jaw tightened. "No, you really don't." Jonathan dusted himself off and finally spoke, his voice calm but authoritative. "Sergeant Davis, is this how your officers are trained?" Rebecca blinked. How did this man know her sergeant's name? Davis turned to her, his expression one of pure disappointment. "Thornton, you just laid hands on our new deputy commissioner." The blood drained from Rebecca's face. "What?" Jonathan crossed his arms. "Jonathan King, newly appointed deputy commissioner of this department." Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. Her mind reeled as she processed the implications of what she had just done. This wasn't just any black man she had profiled and assaulted. He was her boss. The bystanders who had been watching the scene unfold erupted in a mix of laughter, outrage, and satisfaction. Phones were out, recording every moment. The power dynamics had shifted instantly, and Rebecca felt her entire career teetering on the edge of a cliff. Sergeant Davis exhaled sharply and looked at Jonathan. "Sir, Jonathan held up a hand. We'll discuss this later, Sergeant. He then turned his gaze back to Rebecca. His eyes were piercing, unforgiving. Officer Thornton, do you have anything to say for yourself? Rebecca stammered. I didn't know who you were. Jonathan's lips curled into a humorless smile. And if I were just an ordinary black man? What then? Rebecca had no answer. To be continued. Part 3. The Fallout. The next morning, the video of the incident had gone viral. News stations ran the footage on repeat. Social media exploded with outrage, and the department found itself at the center of a scandal. Calls for Rebecca Thornton's termination flooded in from activists, politicians, and even members of the police force. Rebecca sat in the precinct's briefing room, her fingers anxiously tapping the table as she waited for the inevitable. She had barely slept. Every news segment she saw, every comment she read online only made the knot in her stomach tighten. She knew what was coming. The door opened, and in walked Sergeant Davis, followed by Jonathan King. Rebecca shot to her feet, but Davis motioned for her to sit. Jonathan sat across from her, his expression unreadable. "Officer Thornton," he began, his voice calm yet firm, "do you understand the gravity of what you did?" Rebecca swallowed. "Yes, sir." Jonathan exhaled. "Do you? Because what you did wasn't just a bad call. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of a systemic issue, one that I will not tolerate under my leadership." Rebecca lowered her gaze. I wasn't thinking." Jonathan leaned forward. "That's exactly the problem. You weren't thinking. You let prejudice and impulse dictate your actions. And now, you've put this entire department in a crisis." Sergeant Davis cleared his throat. "Sir, I've already launched an internal review. Given the evidence, dismissal is likely." Rebecca's eyes widened. "Please, I've served for years." Jonathan cut her off. "Years don't erase what happened last night. You assaulted a civilian without cause. The only reason you're sitting here and not facing charges is because I chose not to press them." Rebecca's stomach twisted in knots. I'll do better. Give me a chance to prove it." Jonathan studied her for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. "You're suspended, effective immediately. Whether you'll keep your job will depend on the findings of the review board." Rebecca opened her mouth to protest but stopped herself. She had no leverage here. All she could do was nod. Jonathan stood. "You'll be escorted out of the precinct today. If you want redemption, Officer Thornton, it's not going to come from words. It's going to come from real change." As he left the room, Rebecca slumped in her chair, her career hanging by a thread. Rebecca's suspension wasn't just a punishment. It was a public spectacle. News outlets followed her every move, and her name became synonymous with racial profiling. For the first time in her career, she felt the crushing weight of scrutiny, something she had so easily dismissed when others were in the hot seat. Rebecca spent the following weeks in forced isolation, watching her name become a symbol of everything wrong with modern policing. She avoided the news, but it was impossible to escape the backlash. People recognized her in public. Some scowled, others recorded her. A few even shouted at her. Her own fellow officers distanced themselves. Some whispered about her behind her back. Others outright ignored her. Even those who privately shared her views on policing were too afraid to defend her now. One evening, she sat alone in her apartment, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table. A notification flashed on her phone, an email from the department. Subject: Mandatory Bias Training and Community Service Requirement. Her stomach twisted. The department wasn't just considering her job. They were forcing her to confront the very thing she had spent years denying. She had no choice. If she refused, She might as well hand in her badge. Rebecca's first assignment was at a community outreach program. She arrived at a small center in a predominantly black neighborhood, the same kind of area she used to patrol with suspicion. The program director, an older black woman named Ms. Green, greeted her with cold professionalism. "You'll be working with the youth group. Many of them have had bad experiences with officers like you. Don't expect a warm welcome." Rebecca nodded, unsure what to say. As expected, the kids weren't interested in her presence. Some openly glared at her. One teenage boy, Malik, scoffed, "Why's she even here? Y'all trying to teach us how to dodge cops?" Laughter erupted around the room, but Rebecca had no response. Because deep down, she knew they had every reason to distrust her. The next few days were humbling. She heard story after story. Kids who had been harassed, parents who had lost jobs because of wrongful arrests, families torn apart by a system she had upheld without question. Slowly, something inside her cracked. Rebecca started listening more. She stopped speaking in defensive tones. She no longer tried to justify her past actions. The final test came unexpectedly. Malik's older brother, Jamal, was wrongfully arrested just days before Rebecca's service was supposed to end. Without thinking, she went to the station, demanded to see the arresting officer, and used every bit of her remaining influence to push for Jamal's release. It wasn't easy, but eventually the truth came out. Jamal had been profiled, just as Rebecca had once done to others. When she returned to the community center, the kids looked at her differently. Not with trust, but with something close to acknowledgement. Malik simply nodded. "You did good." And for the first time in a long time, Rebecca felt something she hadn't expected. Maybe, just maybe, she could change. To be continued?